Everyone saw the two men crawling, but no one asked why. They weren't soldiers on a battlefield or athletes training for grit. They were intruders, broken and desperate, dragging themselves across my gravel driveway toward a white van with its hazard lights blinking like a distant mocking beacon. One man's leg bent at an angle no human body should endure, his boot scraping uselessly through the wet grass. The other clutched his shin as though holding it together by sheer force of will, his elbows digging trenches in the dirt as he pulled himself inch by inch. And standing behind them, chewing clover as casually as if nothing had happened, was Carl, 200 pounds of wool, horn, and righteous fury, my ram, my guardian, my unlikely ally in a war I never wanted. The sky above was heavy with gray clouds, dusk bleeding across Stone River Lake, and I stood on my porch with the cordless phone pressed against my ear. 911, what's your emergency? The dispatcher's voice was calm, almost routine, as though broken trespassers were part of her daily checklist. I kept my own voice steady, falling back into the old medic tone that had once calmed bull riders bleeding in the dirt. 2 adult males with apparent closed fractures of the lower extremities, I said, watching them writhe. Likely tib-fib breaks. Conscious, alert, but in significant pain. No bone through the skin that I can see. There was a pause. The kind of pause that happens when someone in an air-conditioned office can't quite believe what they're hearing. Copy that, sir. Any weapons present? Just my porch bat, I answered. Raccoon chaser, not using it. Carl clacked a hoof against the porch rail, nosing into the receiver like he was offering his own testimony. The dispatcher's voice tightened. Sir, is the animal that struck the man still nearby? I glanced down at him. His jaw moved lazily, chewing as though the entire evening had been nothing more than a mild workout. He's calm now, I said. He's a domestic ram. I have him under control. She told me to keep my distance, to advise the suspects not to move. I raised my voice across the yard. Stay still, help's coming, don't stand. The thinner one turned his head, eyes wide with something that was equal parts pain and terror. He keeps staring at me, he gasped. He's chewing, I said. That's how he looks when he chews. Beside me, my 2 border collies, Buck and Daisy, sat rigid and watchful. On the porch rail, 3 dwarf goats balanced like a jury, their eyes fixed on the spectacle below with unnerving curiosity. My odd little family, an animal gang, some might call it, had become both witnesses and enforcers tonight. The dispatcher asked what had happened, and I stared out at the 2 broken men crawling toward their van, at Carl pawing the earth like a judge who'd already delivered his verdict. It's a little complicated, I said at last. One gentleman slipped and fell on my dock stairs. The other had what I'd call a dynamic disagreement with my livestock. Her silence told me she'd never heard that phrase before. A disagreement with your livestock? Yes, ma'am, I said, leaning against the porch post. It happens, but right now, my primary concern is aid. Can you confirm paramedics are on the way? She did, adding that sheriff's deputies were en route as well. That detail landed in my chest like a stone. Deputies, that meant questions, reports, a whole lot of scrutiny. And if I knew one thing, it was this. The sheriff's department hated HOA disputes. They called them civil matters. Which meant unless someone was bleeding, and tonight someone was, law enforcement wanted no part of it. As the dispatcher kept talking, my eyes went to the crawling men again. They looked less like dangerous trespassers now and more like clowns, in some tragic farce, fumbling toward escape. Yet beneath the slapstick misery was something darker, something that had begun weeks earlier with a woman named Karen Brown and a clipboard full of lies. That's the part no one sees in the moment, the way a storm builds in silence long before the lightning strikes. Tonight's storm had ended with crawling men and broken bones, but it started in quiet. It started with the reason I bought this place at all. Peace. 15 years I'd spent patching up cowboys, rodeo medics rushing into dirt arenas where 2,000-pound bulls danced on men's chests. I'd heard every kind of scream a human throat could make. I'd smelled blood soaked into dust. When I finally walked away from that life, I didn't want crowds or rules or HOA newsletters telling me what color my fence ought to be. I wanted water lapping against a shore, wind through pines, the soft sounds of my herd, the collies, the goats, the ram who had become as much my family as any human could be. That's what drew me to the north shore of Stone River Lake. 20 acres. A modest house, a solid barn, enough pasture to keep my herd happy. But the real treasure wasn't the view or the soil, it was the deed. Old, flowery legal language, stamped and sealed decades before any HOA was ever dreamed up. A clause written, in iron, a perpetual farm use exemption. My land was untouchable. A stubborn island of agriculture in a sea of manicured lawns. At least that's what I thought. For a year, it was paradise. I worked as a farrier, trimming and shoeing horses. Hard, honest work that left my hands aching but my mind clear. In the evenings, I'd sit on the dock with a cold beer, Buck and Daisy at my feet, Carl in the pasture, the goats scheming on the rail. Life was simple. Life was mine. The HOA was just a newsletter I used for kindling. Then Karen Brown became president. The first time I saw her, she was standing outside my fence in a sleek black SUV, white pants crisp as if dirt had never dared touch her, clipboard in hand, eyes sharp as razors. She surveyed my ranch the way a banker inspects collateral, her gaze landing on my dock, my barn, my fence, and finally on Carl. He met her stare with his eerie horizontal pupils. She wrinkled her nose, scribbled something, and drove away without a word. I should have known then. Nothing good ever comes from a clipboard. That was the spark. The beginning of a war she thought she could win with orange flags, bylaws, and security thugs. A war she thought would bend me. She had no idea who she was up against. The first sign that this wasn't just some neighborhood squabble came on a Saturday morning when she didn't just stare from her SUV. She walked up my driveway like she owned it. Karen Brown. The woman with the clipboard and the permanent half smile that never reached her eyes. But this time she wasn't alone. 2 men followed her, both in matching polo shirts with some cheap-looking security logos stitched on the chest. I recognized their builds before I ever knew their names. Stocky, square-shouldered, the kind of men hired to intimidate rather than protect. Carl stood in the pasture, silent, unmoving, his massive head cocked just slightly, horns catching the sunlight. Buck and Daisy shifted to heel at my command, 2 silent sentinels flanking me as I stepped down from the porch. I wasn't armed. I didn't need to be. My land itself was my armor, my deed, my weapon. Mr. Harper, she began, her voice dripping, honey laced with vinegar. I'm Karen Brown, president of the Stone River HOA. I know who you are, I said evenly. This is private property. She laughed, light and airy, but the sound crawled under my skin. Actually, that's what we're here to discuss. She unfurled a rolled map, spreading it across her manicured hands like a queen presenting a proclamation. According to our survey, your fence and nearly all of your dock extend into HOA common area. She pointed to a line on the paper. A line that, if true, cut my shoreline off like a knife wound. Needs to be removed, she declared as though saying it aloud made it reality. I shook my head slowly. My property line runs to the high water mark. It's in my deed, recorded, binding. Her smile tightened, eyes narrowing just enough to betray the steel underneath. We're aware of your unique situation, but HOA bylaws supersede outdated documents, especially when they impact community resources. There it was. The tell. She hadn't said your deed. She'd called it outdated documents. As if the one piece of paper that gave me the legal right to exist here was nothing more than a relic. That's not how property law works, I said, keeping my voice low, calm, but firm. We'll see about that, she snapped, the sugary mask cracking for the first time. She turned, motioned, and her men pulled a handful of bright orange survey flags from their pockets. They stabbed them into my soil one after another, 20 feet inside my fence line, right up along the grass by my dock. This, Karen announced, is the official boundary. You have 30 days to remove your fence and dock from this common area. Fail to comply, and we'll remove them for you. and you'll be billed. That was the moment the fire started in my chest. That was the moment I knew this wasn't about rules or aesthetics. This was theft dressed up as policy. "You're trespassing," I said, the words sharp, unshakable. "You and your men leave. Now." She didn't flinch, didn't even look back at me, just smiled that brittle smile again and walked away, her men trailing behind, leaving behind a trail of orange flags like scars across my lawn. An hour later, a young deputy showed up. I showed him my deed, pointed at the flags. He listened, expression tired, like a man who'd heard too many stories and believed none of them. "Looks like a boundary dispute," he said at last. "Civil matter. Can't get involved." I felt my jaw tighten. They trespassed on my land. "She believes it's their land," he replied. "Until a judge says otherwise, it's your word against hers. Get a lawyer." And with that, he drove away, leaving me standing in my own yard, holding a deed that suddenly felt like a useless scrap of paper. Civil matter. A bureaucratic shrug. That night, when the motion lights clicked on one by one like runway lamps, I saw it. A drone buzzing low over my pasture, wobbling in the wind, its little red eye scanning my property like a spy in the night. Buck barked twice, his serious bark. Daisy's head tracked the shadow. I raised my flashlight, pointed it at the drone. "Private property. You're being recorded." A car door slammed, headlights snapped on. A vehicle rolled away slowly. No plates on the front bracket. I logged the timestamp, pulled still frames from the camera. Evidence. Proof. But still, the weight settled in heavy. I was alone. The law had washed its hands of me. I called my oldest friend, Leo. "She just walked onto my land and planted flags like she was claiming it for Spain," I told him. "Deputy called it a civil matter." "Of course he did," Leo muttered. "Listen, document everything. Every letter, every word, every trespass. And get a lawyer. I know a guy. Bulldog." So, I did. My kitchen table became a war room. I sat hunched in the dusty county clerk's office, flipping through plat books older than I was. And there it was, a survey map from 1952. My property line, clearly marked. Survey notes describing a granite stone marker at the northwest corner, etched with a cross inside a circle. The proof was there all along, buried under years of soil and silence. I made copies, took photographs, brought the evidence home like weapons to sharpen, and then I pounded my own signs into the ground beside Karen's orange flags. Red letters, bold and unforgiving. Private property. No trespassing. Violators will be prosecuted. It was a small act of defiance, but when I stepped back and saw them standing in the grass, defiant against her orange lies, I felt something settle in my chest. This wasn't just survival anymore. This was war. And I knew, deep down, it was only a matter of time before she sent them back. The drizzle had been falling all day, a thin curtain of rain that slicked the grass and turned the dock stairs into treacherous glass. I was in the barn, trimming one of the goat's hooves, when Buck's bark cut through the steady patter on the tin roof. Not the squirrel in a tree bark. The low, warning growl of a dog who knows danger has crossed the line. Daisy joined in, sharp and insistent. My heart kicked. I wiped my hands, walked to the monitor, and saw it. A white van parked at the edge of my driveway. Same one as before. Two men climbing out, their shapes hunched against the rain, their eyes fixed on my fence. And behind them, a second car, navy sedan. Out stepped Karen Brown, umbrella snapping open, her sharp suit somehow untouched by the weather, her arms folded like a general sending troops into battle. I told the dogs to stay, grabbed the old wooden bat from behind the door, and slipped the cell phone onto the porch mount, its camera lens catching the whole scene. The bat wasn't for swinging. It was a talking stick, a symbol. I was too old and too wise to think I'd win a fist fight with two men half my age. But words carry better when you hold something heavy. Karen called across the rain. "Mr. Harper, this is official board action. Daily fines begin today. $500. "Neat number," I said. That per flag or per bad idea? One of the men smirked as he pulled a pool noodle and butterfly net from the van. He muttered, "Animal control." "For fish?" I asked, deadpan. His flush was answer enough. The other lifted his polo shirt just high enough to flash a cheap mall-bought badge, hologram sticker still gleaming like it had been printed that morning. "You're obstructing enforcement," Karen declared, her voice steady but her jaw tight. Raised my bat just enough to point at the red-lettered sign 10 feet away. Private property. "No trespassing." "You're trespassing," I said. "I warned you." "Going to swing that bat?" the bolt cutter man sneered. I opened my hands wide, showing them to the camera. "No, I'm going to film you committing a crime. Then I'll call the sheriff, and then my lawyer will sue you, your boss, and this entire HOA into the dirt. So please, make my day. Cut the wire." For the first time, I saw it. That hesitation, that flicker in their eyes when bravado meets reality. Rain dripped off their caps, their hands uncertain. Karen stood by the mailbox, chin high. But she shifted, just a fraction, like a woman realizing her soldiers weren't built for this fight. But arrogance is a stubborn disease. The bolt cutter man, Frank, as I would later learn, chose swagger over sense. He stepped toward the fence, chest puffed, voice raised. "You don't scare us." His partner, stocky Gus with the crowbar, thought he'd be clever. He broke left, jogging down the slick dock stairs to flank me from behind. That was his mistake. Rain-slick wood. Smooth-soled boots. And one bad step. His foot shot out like it had hit ice, the crowbar clattering off the rail as his shin slammed against the edge. The sound was sharp, brutal, unmistakable, bone-breaking. His scream tore through the wet air, high and raw as he collapsed on the landing, clutching a leg that bent in a way no leg should bend. The yard went silent, save for his cries. Even the rain seemed to hush. Frank froze, bolt cutters slipping from his hands. His eyes darted from his partner writhing on the dock to me, suspicion twisting his face. He thought I'd done something, that I'd set a trap. But panic has its own logic, and his brain short-circuited. He ran, cutting across the pasture, away from Gus's shrieks, away from me, away from the camera that recorded every second. And in that blind sprint, he forgot one crucial fact. Carl. My ram had been watching from 100 feet away, his heavy body still, his dark eyes locked on the chaos. To Carl, this was simple. His flock was threatened. His human was in danger. And one intruder was fleeing like a predator in retreat. Carl lowered his head. The ground shook with the rhythm of hooves pounding mud. He was no pet in that moment. He was instinct carved into muscle and horn. A battering ram, a living missile of wool and fury. Frank might have heard it, might have felt the earth shift beneath him, but he had no time to turn. Carl struck with the precision of something born for this. 200 pounds of momentum, crashing into the back of his leg. The crack was quieter than Gus's, but no less final. His leg folded, his body tumbling forward in a graceless heap. And just like that, both men were down. One screaming, one silent. Carl slowed, shook his massive head and wandered a few feet away, lowering his muzzle to graze as though nothing had happened. The storm might have been raging, the men might have been broken, but to him, the world had returned to balance. His flock was safe. I stood on the porch, phone still recording, the bat at my side. My voice stayed calm, though my pulse thundered. In my ears. "You're on private property. Help's coming." The camera saw everything. My warning. Their aggression. Gus's slip. Frank's flight. Carl's justice. And as the rain poured harder, I knew one thing beyond doubt. This fight had escalated beyond orange flags and letters. This was no longer just a civil matter. It was war. And tonight, the first shots had been fired. The sirens came first, wailing against the storm like some mournful hymn. Their red and blue strobes painted the wet trees in fractured light as the ambulance nosed down my gravel drive, followed close by 2 sheriff's cruisers. I stood on the porch, rain dripping off the brim of my hat, phone still in hand. Out in the yard, Gus clutched his shattered shin, screaming between gasps, while Frank lay pale and quiet in the mud, his leg twisted grotesquely where Carl had corrected his course. The paramedics moved quickly, professional hands working through the chaos. I stepped back, letting them kneel by the fallen men, and turned as another figure approached through the rain. Not the young deputy who had shrugged me off before. This time it was Sheriff Miller himself. Tall, weathered, a man with lines carved deep into his face, eyes sharp but unreadable. I handed him my phone without a word. "It's all there," I said. From the moment they stepped on my land. He leaned against his cruiser, water beating on his jacket, and watched the footage. He saw Karen's men step past my signs. He saw Gus slip on the slick dock stairs. He saw Frank run and Carl strike. He didn't say a word. When the clip ended, he looked up. Not at me, but at Carl, who stood grazing peacefully near the fence. Horns gleaming in the stormlight, a smile tugged at the corner of the sheriff's mouth. In all my years, I've never logged a 2-injury trespass where the ram did the stopping. "I prefer to think of it as a preemptive strike by my head of security," I said, dry as dust. He didn't laugh, but his eyes crinkled. He told me they'd take the video as evidence. Told me the men would be interviewed at the hospital. He didn't say it outright, but I could feel it. The tide had shifted. For the first time, the law wasn't just washing its hands of me. It was listening. But later that night, long after the flashing lights were gone, the storm came in full. Thunder rolled over the lake, lightning ripped the sky in white, jagged veins, and rain hammered the roof like fists. I couldn't sleep. I sat by the window, watching shadows jump with every flash, hearing the echoes of screams and the snap of bone replaying in my head. At 3 a.m, a sheet of wind tore loose a panel on the goat shed. It banged like a drum, panicking the herd. I was out the door before I realized I'd moved, boots splashing in the mud, Buck and Daisy bounding ahead. One goat's tiny horn had wedged into a gap, his eyes wide, body frozen. "Easy, boy," I whispered, sliding on my knees. Daisy pressed steady against his side while I clipped him free with my multi-tool. The kid trembled, then sagged against me, breath slowing under my hand. Another crack of thunder shook the world, splitting a cedar by the dock, smoke curling from its scar. I dragged fuel cans farther from the barn, tied the tin flap down with baling wire, checked Carl where he stood between me and the storm, head lowered like a sentinel. "Promotion holds," I muttered to him. "Head of security." He snorted, once as if he agreed. When the rain softened and the herd was calm again, I stood soaked to the bone, heart pounding. My hands shook, but we were whole. Every soul accounted for. The land had survived another test. By morning, the world smelled new. Rain-clean air swept off the lake, the sky pale and fresh. I walked the shoreline, Daisy padding at my side, Buck sniffing ahead. Down the cove, a kayak bobbed loose, drifting towards stumps, a boy on a nearby dock shouting. I whistled, pushed my flat-bottom skiff into the water, and motored out. The current tugged hard, brown water swirling fast. I hooked the kayak, hauled it onto my deck, and shouted back to the boy. "Tell your daddy he owes my goats a bag of carrots." The kid blinked, shaky but laughing. "Rainbow carrots," I added. "They prefer rainbow." As I eased back to shore, something caught my eye. High up in a pine, wedged like a dart, a drone blinked red. The storm had speared it there. Later, with the orchard ladder, I climbed, plucked it free, tagged the serial number on video. Chain of custody. Another piece of evidence. But it was the shoreline that stopped me cold. The storm had chewed 2 feet of soil off the bank, exposing what lay beneath. At first it looked like just another rock in the mud. But as I crouched, brushing away the wet earth, I saw it clearly. A block of granite, weathered, tall, immovable. And etched into its face, faint but undeniable, was a mark. A circle with a cross carved inside. My breath caught. My hands shook as I ran back to the house, unrolled the certified survey map from 1952 across my truck hood. The notes were there in black ink, written long before Karen Brown was ever born. Boundary marked by chiseled granite stone, bearing the mark of a cross within a circle. It was real. The stone had been there all along, buried just beneath the surface, waiting for the storm to unearth it. I stared at it for a long time, rain dripping off my sleeves. the lake roaring behind me. This wasn't just proof. This was truth carved in stone. And truth, once unearthed, cannot be buried again. The war had changed. I wasn't just defending anymore. I had the weapon I needed to fight back. Everyone thought the fight had ended with broken bones and a ram standing guard over his pasture. But the truth was, that night's storm hadn't just washed away soil. It had washed away the last of my doubt. When the granite marker surfaced, cross-etched deep into its face, it felt like the land itself had risen up to speak for me. This wasn't just a defense anymore. This was a call to arms. I spent the next few days turning my kitchen into a war room. The table was no longer for meals. It was a battlefield. Stacks of papers, maps, photographs, letters, all spread out under the yellow glow of a hanging lamp. The binder I built became both sword and shield. My answer to every orange flag, every smug smile, every fine Karen Brown had tried to hang around my neck. The first section was simple, the deed. My perpetual farm use exemption highlighted in bold yellow, the certified survey map from 1952 beside it, the photographs of the stone marker I had unearthed after the storm. I even posed next to it, that day's newspaper in hand, proof stamped, in pixels that no one could twist away. The second section was video evidence. I clipped and ordered the footage from my cameras, from Karen planting her flags to the moment Carl lowered his head and ended Frank's sprint with a crack of bone. I edited it into a timeline, every second clear. My lawyer Marcus would later call my slow-motion replay of Carl's charge unnecessarily dramatic but legally compelling. Then came the medical records. Through discovery, Marcus pulled the hospital reports. Gus admitted he'd slipped on wet stairs. Frank confessed to being struck by a large animal while running. Their words, not mine. Their own testimony perfectly aligned with my footage. Another section, licensing. Neither man had a valid security license in the state. They weren't professionals. They were just muscle hired off the books. Even the state game warden got involved. When someone filed a complaint about a wild sheep on a dock, she came out in khaki, cool and unimpressed, scanned Carl's ear tag, and announced on camera, "Domestic ram, properly tagged, not my problem." She left with a smirk, and then, just because spite has its place in war, I added a sound test. The HOA had written me up for excessive bleeding. I stood by the fence with a meter. Manny and Mo gave me their best chorus, 58 decibels. Across the cove, Karen's pool pump droned steady at 72. Screenshots slid into the binder. Petty? Maybe. Satisfying? Absolutely. Piece by piece, the narrative sharpened. I wasn't the hermit with a violent ram anymore. I was the calm property owner, the one with documents, cameras, and truth. Karen's men weren't victims. They were trespassers, undone by their own arrogance and Carl's instinct to protect his flock. But even as I closed the binder with a heavy snap, something gnawed at me. Why? Why go to war over a 20-foot strip of shoreline? Why risk lawsuits, humiliation, even broken bones? It wasn't just about beige fences. It couldn't be. There had to be a deeper reason. Leo heard it in my voice when I called. "It doesn't add up," I told him. "She's reckless, sure, but this is too much." "There's always a missing piece," he said, "and it usually has a $sign in front of it." He was right. And the missing piece was about to fall into our hands. Leo's cousin Kevin was the unlikely savior. A quiet IT contractor with all the charisma of a dial-up modem, as Leo put it. But he'd done recent work for a local real estate firm, and when he heard Karen Brown's name, he didn't hesitate. "She treated me like gum on her shoe," he muttered. "Yeah, I'll take a look." What he dug up turned the entire war on its head. It started with a trickle, a conversation with the HOA treasurer, a woman tired of Karen's games. She handed over an affidavit and exported emails. Then Marcus subpoenaed the originals. A day later, Leo called, buzzing like static. "We've got the why," he said. The PDF hit my inbox like a thunderclap. Dozens of emails, text threads, months of correspondence between Karen Brown and a developer named Ron Bishop of Lakeshore Vistas LLC. The story they told was ugly. Bishop had quietly bought up land behind my ranch, Prime real estate, except for one fatal flaw: no lake access. My shoreline was the missing puzzle piece. Without it, his multi-million-dollar condo project would drown before it started. Karen was his inside woman. She would manufacture a boundary dispute, seize my shoreline under the guise of common area, then lease it to Bishop's company. In return, she'd get a 10% finder's fee, hundreds of thousands of dollars, and a free penthouse suite overlooking the very water she tried to steal from me. And in one email, clear as day, her words cut colder than any storm: neutralize. The homeowner. I sat at my kitchen table, coffee gone cold in the mug beside me, reading line after line of conspiracy. My sanctuary, my little slice of heaven, was never about fences or bylaws. It was about greed. About my land becoming the stepping stone for someone else's empire. I felt the fury rise, sharp and clear. This wasn't an HOA dispute anymore. This was a crime. Marcus confirmed it within an hour. "Mitchell," he said, voice sharp with a predator's glee, "this is wire fraud, conspiracy, felony territory. She's finished." I slid the emails into the binder, right behind the granite stone photos, right after the video of Carl lowering his head. The weight of that binder grew heavier, not just with paper, but with truth. I wasn't just defending anymore. I was prosecuting, and the final blow was still coming: a court-ordered survey to prove what the storm had already whispered. When those men in reflective vests arrived with their tripods and scopes, I stood back on my porch, arms crossed, watching them walk the line. Hours later, the lead surveyor unrolled fresh blueprints on my hood. His finger tapped a thick black line. "Mr. Harper, this is your legal property line. That stone marker is dead on. And your fence? It's actually 5 feet inside your own boundary. If anything, you've been giving them your land." I laughed then. Not loud, not triumphant, but low and certain. The trap was set. The evidence was locked. And the final act would play out not in my pasture, but in the lion's den itself, at the monthly HOA meeting. And for once, it wouldn't be me on trial. Everyone expected the monthly HOA meeting to be the same as always: half a dozen retirees squabbling over lawn ornaments, someone griping about the speed of the mailman, maybe a motion about driveway stains. But when I walked into that community clubhouse with Marcus at my side, my thick binder under my arm, the air felt electric. The room was packed wall to wall, every seat filled, people standing along the walls, whispering, buzzing. Word had spread about the trespass, about the men carted off in ambulances, about the ram who defended his home like a knight in woolen armor. Karen Brown sat at the front table with her board. Sharp suit, hair perfect, posture stiff. But her jaw was tight, and even from across the room I could see the strain hiding under the polish. She cleared her throat and began, voice trembling just enough to sound rehearsed, practiced. She painted me as a menace. Said I was flouting community rules, endangering families with aggressive, untamed animals, threatening violence. She spoke of fines unpaid, fences out of compliance, neighbors living in fear. Her voice broke, perfectly timed, as she cast herself as the victim. By the time she finished, a few heads in the audience were nodding. Others looked uncertain, torn between the HOA's president and the stubborn man with the ram, and then she dropped the hammer. "Therefore," she said, steadying her voice, "the board will move tonight to place a lien on Mr. Harper's property for non-compliance and to begin legal action to remove his dangerous animals." A murmur ran through the crowd. Eyes darted to me, to Marcus. Some sympathetic, others doubtful. That was her moment of triumph. And Marcus, patient as a coiled snake, chose that moment to stand. "Madame President," he said, voice cutting like steel through the room, "before you proceed with that illegal course of action, my client and I would like to present some information. Information about your conduct as president of this association." Karen stiffened. "This is not the forum." "It most certainly is," Marcus interrupted smoothly, "especially since it concerns fraud, trespass, and conspiracy under your leadership." Gasps. Chairs shifted, people leaned forward. Marcus opened the binder, laying it flat on the table before him like a general unrolling a war map. He started slow, deliberate. First, the deed. The farm use exemption, highlighted, certified by the county, then the 1952 survey map. He projected photographs of the granite stone onto the big screen at the front of the room. The one the storm had unearthed, marked with a circle and cross, standing exactly where the old plat book said it should. This stone, Marcus said, was verified last week by a court-ordered survey. And those surveyors found something else. Mr. Harper's fence isn't encroaching on common land. It's 5 feet inside his legal property line. If anything, he's been giving this HOA a slice of his land for free. The room stirred. Whispers broke out. Faces turned toward Karen, pale now beneath the fluorescent lights. Marcus didn't stop. He shifted to the video. The screen flickered, showing Karen's men trespassing, brandishing tools, ignoring my warnings. Then Gus slipping on the slick dock stairs, the sickening crack echoing through the speakers. The crowd winced. Then Frank running across my pasture and Carl, my ram, a blur of muscle and horn, striking with merciless precision. The room gasped, then chuckled nervously. Someone whispered, "Go, Carl," and laughter rippled through the tension. Karen leaned into her mic. That footage is edited. Marcus held up a sealed evidence bag, the drone's SD card tagged and labeled. Chain of custody, raw files, authentic. A neighbor in the back, Marty, ham radio enthusiast, cupped his hands. Breaker, looks like truth on Channel 9. The room laughed again. Even the board's lawyer fought a smile. Then Marcus dropped the real bomb. He clicked to the next slide. An email projected in bold across the screen. Karen's words neutralized the homeowner. The room went cold. Karen stammered. "That's industry shorthand." "For fraud?" Marcus asked smoothly. The crowd erupted in murmurs, anger rising, like a tide. That's when the side door opened. Sheriff Miller walked in with 2 deputies, his voice calm, even. "We have a search warrant for HOA communications." He strode to the board table. Deputies began collecting phones, laptops, papers. The room fell into stunned silence, and then Marcus showed the final piece. The emails between Karen and Ron Bishop of Lakeshore Vistas. The plan laid bare. Seize my shoreline, lease it to his development company, pocket a fortune. Her promised penthouse suite, her 10% finder's fee. People shot to their feet, shouting, some in disbelief, some in fury. Karen sat frozen, her face a mask cracked wide open. The sheriff leaned down, murmured something to her, and she stood only when the deputies helped her up. They led her out, the crowd parting in stunned silence, whispers following like smoke. The meeting was chaos now. Voices overlapped, chairs scraped, neighbors stared at me with something new in their eyes. Not suspicion, not doubt. Respect. Vindication. I hadn't just defended my home. I'd pulled back the curtain and shown the rot. And for the first time, since Karen Brown set foot on my land, I felt something close to peace. But the war wasn't over yet. The HOA might have lost its queen, but the game wasn't done. Not until the courts weighed in. Not until every flag was pulled, every lie nailed down. The binder was heavy in my arms as I left the clubhouse, but it didn't feel like a burden anymore. It felt like armor, and behind me, faint over the commotion, someone shouted the words I'd hear 100 times after, "Go, Carl." The days after the meeting felt like the eye of a storm, quiet, but heavy with the knowledge that something irreversible had just happened. Karen Brown, once untouchable in her navy suits and sharp heels, had walked out of the clubhouse between 2 deputies. The gossip spread faster than wildfire, curling through every cul-de-sac and lakeside deck. By morning, the story wasn't just neighborhood talk, it was front-page news. Local headlines blared, HOA president accused of fraud and conspiracy. Reporters camped at the edge of Stone River Lake, pointing cameras at the white fences and manicured lawns of people who suddenly had plenty to say. Some called her a tyrant, others a visionary gone wrong, but all agreed on one thing: Karen had been caught in the act. The charges came quickly: conspiracy to commit fraud, wire fraud, abuse of office. And though the legal wheels turned slow, the court of public opinion moved fast. I wasn't prepared for what came next. Where once my neighbors glanced away when I walked down the gravel drive, now they stopped. They waved, They came to the fence line with cautious smiles and awkward words. Pontoon boats idled near my dock, passengers calling out, "That your ram? Go, Carl!" and raising beers in salute. I hadn't asked for it. I hadn't wanted it. But I had become something I never imagined. A folk hero. Even the HOA, broken and shamed, tried to piece itself back together. With Karen gone, the board scrambled. They called for an emergency election. And in a twist no one saw coming, my nervous neighbor Trent, the same man who once measured recycling bins with a tape measure, was chosen interim president. He stood trembling at the microphone the first night, glasses slipping down his nose, and announced his first act, a formal apology addressed to me, signed by the board, read aloud to the community. "We failed Mr. Harper," he said, his voice shaking. "And we failed ourselves. From this day forward, we will not allow corruption, deceit, or intimidation to poison this community again." His second act was even bolder. He drafted a covenant amendment, not just to recognize my perpetual farm use exemption, but to protect any historic deed properties inside the HOA's reach. He called it the Stone Marker Amendment. It passed unanimously. For the first time since the orange flags pierced my lawn, I felt the fire in my chest ease. Yet even in victory, I couldn't escape the question that had haunted me since the IROM. First knock on my door. How far is too far to defend your home? I thought about the moments replayed 100 times in my mind. Standing on the porch with a bat I never intended to swing, watching Gus's leg break on the slick dock stairs, hearing the sharp crack echo in my bones. Watching Frank run and Carl lower his head, instinct carrying him into brutal collision. There's a fine line between justice and vengeance, between protection and destruction. And I wondered, in the dark of the night when the lake was still and only the goats murmured, in the pasture, how close I had come to crossing it. But then I'd see Buck curled at my feet, Daisy pressed against my leg, Carl grazing quietly beyond the fence. My little animal gang, my family. They hadn't acted out of malice. They'd acted out of loyalty, out of instinct. They had stood when the law had faltered, when the deputy shrugged, when the system turned its back, and maybe that was the truth worth holding on to. Sometimes it isn't lawyers or sheriffs who hold the line. Sometimes it's the simple, stubborn loyalty of those who love you, whether they walk on 2 legs or 4. Weeks passed. The lawsuits from the injured guards vanished into quiet settlements against the HOA. Their names slipped from the headlines, leaving only Carl, immortalized as the hero ram of Stone River. Lakeshore vistas dissolved overnight, Ron Bishop disappearing from the state like smoke on water, and slowly the neighborhood thawed. The waves from passing boats grew friendlier, the people on decks raised their glasses higher. I was no longer the eccentric hermit with livestock. I was the man who stood his ground when no one else would. But the truth? I wasn't looking for fame. I wasn't chasing respect. I just wanted what I had always wanted: peace. A patch of land where the only arguments came from goats over carrots, where the only battles fought were with weeds in the garden. And though the storm had dragged me through fire, the land had given me what I needed to endure: an unshakable stone, a ram with a head like iron, and the reminder that sometimes defending your home isn't about winning, it's about refusing to lose. And I hadn't lost. Not this time. The lake was quiet the evening it all finally settled. Not courtroom quiet, not meeting room tense, just the kind of stillness that comes when the world exhales after a long, bitter storm. The sun melted down over Stone River, bleeding gold, into the water until it shimmered like liquid fire. I sat on the edge of my dock, boots dangling just above the ripples, a cold beer sweating in my hand. Buck lay stretched at my side, paws twitching in some dream chase. Daisy curled against my leg, her steady breathing a rhythm older than words. Behind us, the goats murmured, their soft bleats drifting across the pasture. Manny pawed at the fence rail, Mo tried to climb it, and Jack just stared into space like he was waiting for enlightenment. Simple, stubborn souls, every one of them. And then came the heavy tread. Wood creaked as Carl stepped onto the dock, horns catching the last slant of light, casting curved shadows on the planks. He nudged my elbow with that massive head. Not Rough, not demanding, just a reminder. I'm here. I always was. I reached over, scratched his chin where the coarse wool thinned, and he leaned into my hand with a contented grunt. His eyes closed, body swaying slightly, like all was finally right in his world again. For a long while, we sat there, man and ram, watching the sun sink, and in that silence, the memories washed back. The knock on the door, the orange flag stabbing, my lawn, the crack of bone on wet stairs, the thunder of hooves, the laughter, the fear, the anger, the vindication. I thought about Karen, about the greed that had driven her to risk it all for a penthouse and a cut of dirty money. I thought about the neighbors who'd once looked at me as an oddity and now raised their glasses in salute. I thought about the binder, thick with truth, heavy with justice, still sitting on my kitchen table. But mostly I thought about this. How close I had come to losing the very thing I'd fought for. My peace, my sanctuary, my herd, my little world carved out of the noise. The water lapped soft against the posts. The air smelled of pine and damp earth. For the first time in months, I wasn't bracing for a knock, a drone, a van, or a fine. For the first time, the quiet felt safe again. I turned my head, looking at Carl, his great horns gleaming in the twilight. He wasn't a weapon. He wasn't a headline. He wasn't even a hero, not in the way people tried to make him. He was just part of the family, a creature who had acted not out of violence, but out of instinct, out of loyalty. And maybe that was the purest kind of defense of all. I let out a long breath, felt the tension leave my shoulders, and let the thought settle deep. I hadn't just won a fight. I had protected something sacred. The land was safe. The herd was safe. The quiet was mine again. The orange flags were gone now, pulled from the soil and tossed aside, replaced by the old granite stone that stood where it always had, silent and immovable. A reminder that some truths don't bend, no matter how many clipboards try to erase them. Out across the water, a pontoon boat drifted by. Someone waved. I raised my bottle in quiet reply. The voices carried across the lake, half joking, half sincere. Go, Carl. Carl flicked an ear, unimpressed, still chewing his cud. I smiled. Sometimes the strongest stand isn't loud or violent. Sometimes it's just holding your ground, staying rooted when the world tries to shove you off balance. Trusting that truth, persistence, and the loyalty of those who stand beside you, whether they speak or bleat, will be enough. And in the fading light, with my ram pressed steady against my arm and my dogs breathing at my feet, I knew one thing. With absolute certainty, the war was over. The animal gang and I had won, and this time the turf was ours to keep.